If you were here on Monday, can you guess what I'm thinking about? Yes. So I actually have that quote on my corkboard outside my office because do you know how they define weeds? What is a weed? They actually define it as a plant growing in a area where you don't want it. That's a weed.
That's so hard.
And so, like, if you are a corn grower, if you grow corn for your livelihood, if you have a bunch of alfalfa in there, it's a weed, even though alfalfa can be very useful, right? So, Ralph had it right. It's like, really, what is a weed? There's so many plants out there that people call weeds, and yet they have a lot of value, including dandelions. So here, do you know about No Mow May? Some people do, some don't. So enlighten people around you, advocate No Mow May. It's a good thing to do because of the early pollinators that come out. It's a really important resource for them. And so No Mow May, you can actually get the sign. You can purchase the sign and put it in your yard to help educate those around you. So that's the actual sign that you can purchase. I can't remember how much it is, but every part of the plant is useful. Here's a weird thing. They have this ability to reproduce asexually through their seeds, which is really weird. It's called apomixis. I'll actually mention it again later in the semester, but that word means without mixing. And so they can produce seeds even without pollination, which when we get to the section on angiosperms, that's not how we say about pollination. This is really, really odd, but they can do it. So what they do is they produce these seeds, but there's no sperm and egg finding each other. There's no pollination. And so, but yet they go ahead and produce a seed. So basically it's a seed that's a clone of the parent plant. Very, very unusual. There's only a handful of plants that we know can do this. Not me personally, but plant biologists are very interested in this idea because if you find like the perfect crop plant and they can do apomixis, then you'd have this very steady supply of that plant. It'd be identical. And so a lot of people are looking at that. Yes.
Could that be like helicopters? Like, those like things like spin? Are they also?
I don't think so. Yeah, so dandelions can do this idea. Blackberries. There's one other I'm trying to recall. I'm blinking. I'll look it up. I know where to find it in my office. I'll look it up. It's there. So every part is useful. You get high levels of key vitamins and potassium, iron, and zinc. In fact, they have more carotene in their leaves than carrots. Your parents are always telling you to eat your carrots. Now you can tell them dandelion leaves. Do that. Rich in antioxidants. They're looking at, I think for sure it can help your immune system just by preventative healthy living. All parts are edible, even the roots. Some people that have high taste for bitter might find the leaves a little bitter. So I think it depends on your taste buds. The flowers, apparently the flowers you can eat too, those aren't as bitter from my experience. But there are ways to process. You could blanch the leaves, which is just boiling them for a brief time before you ingest. Or a trick to do when they're still growing is to cover them a little bit so the sun can't beat down on them. Not even for a couple of weeks. You don't need usually that long. But what that does is it reduces the bitter compound. Sunlight really enhances the concentration of that in the leaves. So if you cover the plant right before you want to harvest it, it will reduce that. So I have a little bit in the notes, a little bit more about the bitter compound if you want to look in the notes. Oh, I have to post this, I guess, for you to look in the notes. I'll post it. And so they typically say the younger leaves are less bitter, but they're still, some people find them still a little bit bitter. Has anyone eaten dandelion leaves? Do you find them bitter to your
Just
taste?
a little.
Yeah. They say you can like, mix it in with your other greens or like chop them up and sprinkle them. Yeah, yeah. So there's ways to incorporate. It's not like you need a big bowl of dandelion leaves and that's it, you can mix it in. You can blanch them. So lots of options, but when you look, what are they using dandelions for? It's incorporated into moisturizers, salves.
Actually found dandelions better for sunburn, like it heals faster
Really?
than like aloe.
Oh, I'll have to try that.
It's a crazy thing for me.
Yeah, yeah.
Burn really
Right, yeah.
goes away.
Oh, that's great to know. I burn really easy. I don't tan, I burn. So wart remover, hopefully we don't have to deal with that. Natural yellow dyes are beautiful. Some people brew a tea out of dandelions to apply to their garden to boost natural fertilizer. And of course, dandelion tea and dandelion wine. And this is not a complete list, so there's my comeback. One of my brother-in-laws is just like, well, both of them, two of them, I should say. My brother and my brother-in-law, there we go. They are like waging war on dandelions, so I think I'm gonna send them this. And even though I'm the little sister, and what do I know? But the older we get, they're finally starting to like, oh, she knows stuff, like, yes, I know stuff. Yeah, there you go. So I'll post that into Educat. It's not something I'm gonna test you on, but I just wanted to do my part to give.
The pro tip about eating dandelions.
Yeah.
don't eat them straight out of your yard because they've been getting run over by the lawnmower a ton, and that makes them really gross.
Makes them really what?
Gross and bitter when they're ones that have like regrown a bunch.
Yes, yeah, like purposely grow dandelions,
They have a separate.
Yeah.
have been run over.
Like I actually have a big like pot that I just grow my dandelions in.
Those
so.
will stay expired.
Yeah.
The ones who've been.
Ones you actually care for and instead of abuse with the lawnmower over and over, so. Yeah, all right, so. Now. Let's get back into roots. Before I do that, remember about this assignment, please. So in these questions, I'll say use the abbreviation or one word answer only. Please adhere to that because that's how the grading thing is set up in Educat, so it can be computer graded. So if you didn't do that, let me know, but moving forward, I think last I checked, only like 7 people did it, but pay attention to what I say. Like if I say one word or use the abbreviation, spelling counts, make sure that you're doing that because that's how I set up the answer key. Okay, so it's due by Friday, 11 a.m. All right, so we've been looking at roots deep into the soil. We've looked at the different zones. And we've also considered the root cap, which is very necessary. And then the mucogel that's excreted to help the roots grow through the soil and reduce damage due to the frictional forces of the soil. It's usually the maturation zone where we see those lovely root hairs. You will be looking at root hairs tomorrow in lab, probably using the dissecting scope. You'll see radish root hairs and they're quite extensive and beautiful. And that's what you're damaging when you repot your plants. You can't help, no matter how kind you are to your plant, you will be damaging these. So please be kind to your plant and water it pretty consistently for a few days because that's where they're doing their water absorption. That's what those root hairs are just so well designed for that. Okay, so we've gone through this idea. What's new? All right, so when you look at the maturation zone where the cells are pretty much set up, they're doing their defined role, you'll have a region that they call the cortex. and I'll be showing you pictures here, but let's get it down in words. So the cortex region is just a bunch of parenchyma cells that are there. But it's when they say, oh, look at the cortex, it's a physical region full of parenchyma cells, okay? And so here's a cross section of a root. And you can see that the cortex has a pretty extensive region. So, they labeled the epidermis, which is usually this one cell thick, and then all the rest is pretty much the cortex region, except for where you're going to find the vascular tissue. All right, so the cortex region is this big swath all the way around. Now, all of those dark little granules that you see in the cells, kind of like a purpley look. Do you know, have we done that yet? Yeah, have you done that? Have you used iodine in lab yet?
Yeah.
What does that pick up on when you put starch? So those are all starch grains. That's right, you've looked at starch grains. So starch grains are packed away in the root as long-term storage for the plant to have, a source of carbohydrate. So then when you go to the center of this root, you see this circular region here, and then inside of that is the vascular tissue. So that circular area, that ring of cells, is called the endodermis. You will need to know that. It's usually a single cell, single cells in a ring. And you can see in this that they've stained the root, and it's popping that bright red. Do you remember what pops bright red with fluoroglucinol stain that you used in lab? Cell wall, particularly lignin. So secondary cell walls pop red. All right, lignin. All right, and then on the right picture, figure B, they kind of blown up the vascular tissue, endodermis area. All right, so I'm going to show you another picture here soon, but the endodermis, the reason it's popping red like that is it has that nice thick wall, and then it also has these suberin bands that are part of the cell wall area. And those, so remember, suberin is really waxy. It's very, very waxy. And so that's called the Casparian strips, and I'll show you an image of that. Basically, though, when they were studying why does this endodermis have these unusual suberin bands, what's going on with that? I'm not going to go into all the details because it gets pretty, it's a long explanation. But basically what it does is it provides a mechanism to keep the water and minerals flowing into the vascular tissue, into the xylem, rather than coming back out. You want like a positive flow. The roots take up water and minerals, get it across these cells, get it to the vascular tissue. You don't want it to flow backwards out of the vascular tissue. And so this Casparian strip actually provides a mechanism for that, so that that can happen, okay? So let me show you another image, trying to get this across. So here is your endodermis here, okay? So it's right along here. And then they've blown up the endodermis on figure B. So this band of suberin, it's kind of like taking a cardboard box and putting a rubber band around it, where the rubber band is like your suberin, and it's very hydrophobic. And again, I'm not going to go into the physics and chemistry of this, but basically it forces a situation where water and minerals have to go pretty much just one way into the vascular tissue of the root. It won't allow for it to come back out. So that's what they're trying to get across there. Figure A is looking at how are the root hairs. Okay, so the root hairs take up the water, which are the black lines, the water and minerals. And then how is the water getting transported through that cortex region? And basically, they've only focused on one way, which is, if you look carefully where that black line is, you can see that the water and the dissolved minerals are skirting around all the cells. They're not going into the cells, the parenchyma cells, they're just skirting around in the cell wall space. And the fancy word for that is apoplast. APO, plast. Ah, silly thing. Apoplast movement. So if we say, oh, it's going by apoplast movement, what we mean is it's all in the cell wall spaces. It's not diving into any of the cells. That's pretty efficient. That's a pretty efficient way to get the water very quickly to the center of the root to get it to the xylem. Yes. Yes. Yep. Middle lamella, cell wall. Yep. I mean, it goes right through there. Okay, let's go back here to this image again. So this is one of the previous images. I've just kind of isolated a section of it where you can see that endodermis. Then if you go right to the inside of the endodermis, there's another ring of cells. That's called the pericycle. That's important because it will it can continue to divide and produce new cells and grow. And basically its job is to form lateral roots. So it seems kind of weird that when you look at lateral roots coming out, they're deep in they start deep in the tissue, not near the periphery. So this is a lateral root that's coming out from the pericycle region. So that lateral root has to grow through all that cortex and then bust out of the epidermis and then form its own lateral root. So it's kind of odd, but that's their method. So the pericycle is another active area of cell division for lateral roots. And depending on the root structure, you might make a lot of these. Maybe not so much. Here's a mock-up of that. Okay. Now, this slide is zooming in to just angiosperms. We're just thinking about the flowering plants. And when you classify the angiosperms, the first thing you ask is, once you figure out it's a flowering plant, then you say, is it a dicot or is it a monocot? Those are your two options. And so that's what we're seeing here. And you can tell that their root structure does vary. So if you take a section of a root of a plant and you're like, I wonder if this is a dicot or monocot, you can easily figure it out just by looking at a cross section of the roots. And so here you're seeing that what we've been looking at in the previous slides, where right dead in the center, you have this vascular tissue. And then if you compare it to the picture on the right, you can see it's a little different design. So really, when you're looking at what's different, you often zoom into where is the vascular tissue. That's often what you see as a big difference in design. And so with the dicot here, and we'll read the way I remember it's a dicot is the center, the vascular tissue kind of looks like a plus sign or a cross sign, like, you know, two portions, dicot, two portions to a plus sign. And so the big red areas are, let me show you a close up. I'll come back to this slide. So the big red areas that look like a plus or a cross, that's the xylem. Remember when you stain with fluoroglucinol, the cell walls pop red, the secondary cell walls. And then the phloem are always tucked away in the little corners or the crevices around the plus sign. So the xylem and phloem clustered together like that and then surrounded by the endodermis. So that's a dicot root. The other way I know that this is a root and not a stem Like if someone just threw this on a slide and said, hey, look at this, I'd have to figure out, am I looking at stem or root? And the way to tell is a dicot root tends to have its vascular tissue smack in the middle of the cross section. And that's okay because the roots are buried in the soil. I'll come back to this idea. If you're buried and surrounded by soil, you don't need to have a bunch of really sturdy architecture further out here where you beef it up because you're surrounded and packed in by soil. So you're good. You can stick your very tough cells, your vascular tissue in the center, and it's okay. So dicot roots have that kind of morphology. Monocot roots, the way I remember that is a monocot root has a single ring. So single ring, mono of vascular tissue. So that's what they're trying to show here. Where in the drawing up there too, where they've put the xylem as the blue and the phloem as the green. So monocot roots. Let me pull up a larger. So the larger cells that you see are the xylem. So the really, really large ones, those are, so xylem have two subtypes. Do you remember? Xylem has two subtypes. Vessels and tracheids. And of those two, one is definitely bigger. Vessels, V, remember the top of a V is really big, vessels are bigger. And so that's what you're seeing there. They're pointing to the vessels, and then the tracheids are the smaller kind of reddish purple cells in here. And then the phloem is, to my eye, it kind of looks bluish green. These bluish green, more delicate looking cells that are right there. I'll show you another picture. Here's a really nice, easy to see. So here you have some vessels and some tracheids around it. And then this kind of delicate blue-green are phloem. What's this thing? Lateral root. Yeah, we got, oh, there's another one up there too. Two lateral roots coming out. And then this area here, this is just parenchyma cells, all right? All of this in the middle is parenchyma. All of this is, well, not all, but most of this is parenchyma. You have a little bit of fibers there. All right, so you definitely see a difference in morphology of a monocot root versus a dicot root. And we're going to see that again when we look at stems. We're going to see difference in how they look compared to each other. So please understand the anatomy, both in longitudinal section of a root, where we looked at the different zones, and then here in cross section, where you can think about the different portions of the root in cross section. Questions on anatomy? All right, so roots are buried into the soil where hopefully there's plentiful water, but not too much. You don't want the whole water, the soil system swamped and waterlogged, because then the roots can't breathe, so to speak. They need oxygen, just like we need oxygen. But hopefully there's enough water and some nice air spaces for easy movement of oxygen. So one of their huge jobs is to bring up water and minerals. And so, of course, plant physiologists wanted to, figure that all out pretty early on. So this research has been going on for centuries, and they've been looking at this idea of how is the water getting brought into the plant and then coursing through the plant, especially when you start thinking about these massive tall trees. How in the world is this happening? And basically, a lot of different scientists worked on this over the years. There's a lot of debate, but this is the current theory called the cohesion tension theory. And the experimental data is supporting this very strongly. And so cohesion and tension is part of that phrase. Cohesion is referring to the water molecules themselves. Water likes to cohere to each other. Water molecules like other water molecules. And so it's this idea of cohering water molecules. By the way, so the transpiration topic is coming from that chapter on water. So there's a section, a range of pages I want you to read. And this cohesion tension theory is in there. All right, so what they discovered is that once the water and the dissolved minerals get into the xylem of the root, it gets brought up through the plant, up into the stem, branches, leaves, the veins of the leaves, and then it exits out of the leaves. How will it get out? Stomata, all right? So when it exits out of the leaf, it's no longer liquid, it's in the vapor form. It's water vapor that will exit out of the leaf stomata. What they discovered is there's only one way to do this. You can't have water up in the leaf veins coming down to the roots. It doesn't work. They've never witnessed that in terms of transpiration processes. So we say it's a unidirectional flow. Roots take up the water and minerals and bring it into the body, and it goes all the way up to the leaves, turns into water vapor, and exits the leaf. So they also discovered pretty early on that the only way to get transpiration to happen, which is movement of water through the plant body, the only way to get it to work is if the stomata are actually open. If the stomata are closed, plants don't do transpiration. They may have water in their xylem, but it's just sitting there. It's not moving. So stomata must be open in order for this to happen. So once they figured that out, things started to fall pretty nicely into place, because then they started looking at, okay, when stomata open up, what kind of forces are being applied to the water in the xylem of the vein? And that took some time, but they were able to figure out that as the water is escaping out of the leaf, it actually generates a tension force on the water molecules. So we call it a tension gradient will develop, where you actually have a really strong tension in the leaf veins. And then we say it's a gradient because if you test the tension further away, like in the stem or in the roots, it's a lower tension. So you get this gradient, high tension up in the leaves, lower tension down. And as long as you can maintain that tension gradient, what's really happening is water is being pulled up the plant. All right, it's being pulled up or sucked up with the force originating in the leaves. So when they first looked at this was not what they proposed. They thought water got pushed up from the roots. And so they were looking there first for a force that could push, but it just can't happen. They did all the physical, chemical tests and measurements, and they quickly realized that's not happening, especially when you think about, giant sequoia trees or something. So they actually, did a 180 and said, well, let's look in the leaves and see what's happening. And that's when they discovered this tension gradient idea. So the leaves are where you get that start of a tension gradient, and it starts as soon as the stomata open up. Does that make sense? Okay, so if the plant closes its stomata in the middle of the day and, it was transpiring, and then it says, oh, I'm going to close down, I'm sensing drought. There's still some water in the plant. It's not causing it to move through on a steady basis. So plants, once they open their stomata, they can't stop this. Like, there's no way they have like a toggle switch where they're like, oh, yeah, I'm going to stop the tension gradient. You can't. It would defy the laws of physics. So that's why they say that, plants have to be so careful and so mindful by always assessing their water availability. Like, how much water do I have? And because I know as soon as I open my stomata, I'm going to be having water exiting my body. Yes.
How about like drowning like the plant by accident, like you just had too much of the water?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why aren't they able to like just get rid of that access? Like why?
Yeah.
Under the ground.
Like they.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really the oxygen that's killing them. So when they get, well, it's not quite that simple, but basically, if you waterlog a soil, the roots essentially asphyxiate. They run out of oxygen and it's like choking someone, they just can't breathe. They can't breathe. They asphyxiate.
It's on the roots.
Yeah, it's so there's no more available oxygen because you've waterlogged the soil. So now that all the air pockets in the soil are full. It's just solid water in the soil. And so oxygen is oxygen gas does not diffuse through water or liquids very easily. It's a very slow process. It's just not very efficient. So if you waterlog the soil, you're essentially slowly asphyxiating the plant. There's more stuff happening, like microbes in the soil that like to live without oxygen, then they get to high populations and then they start producing toxic compounds that hurt the plant. So it's like there's a domino impact, but the biggest one is they asphyxiate essentially. Other questions on the transpiration? Okay, so this is a constant kind of assessment for them throughout the day because of course they want their stomata open to take in carbon dioxide to run the Calvin cycle. But if they're in a drought mode, then they might have to close their stomata or maybe close down a little bit more and only be like 10% open instead of 100%. So this is a constant problem. And so they definitely say it's a compromise that the plant is constantly making where they know, so to speak, they know they're going to be losing water through their body as soon as their stomata is open, but yet they want that carbon dioxide. So it's a constant assessment on their part. All right, now, the rhizosphere is a term that you hear a lot when you talk about roots. And so it's a very vague definition. The rhizosphere is that area of the soil that is influenced by the roots. That's pretty much the definition. It's the area of the soil that's influenced by the roots. So one thing they figured out pretty early on is that roots are what we say they're leaky. Roots are leaky in the sense that the root cap is constantly getting sloughed off, that mucogel sloughs off, cells die routinely and get sloughed off. Lots of chemicals get exuded out of the roots. So not just the root cells are sloughing off, but you have excretion of chemicals out. They're leaky. And so all kinds of chemicals. I mean, the list is amazing when you look at everything they're excreting out of the roots.
How would you define like the rhizosphere in like the hydroponic setting?
Yeah, I don't know if they have a definition for that.
Would you even call it a rhizosphere?
Probably, well, we would call it a rhizoplane.
Rhizoplane.
So they actually have that word, rhizoplane, which is the surface of the roots essentially, because like my one student, Veronica, grad student, she just defended last semester and she was looking at hydroponic experiment, and then she was assessing what microbes are on the surface of the root, what microbes are in the root. And so we had to define like that's the rhizoplane on the surface. So in a soil environment, the soil is incredibly busy with all kinds of organisms. But if you look specifically at the rhizosphere portion of the soil, it's even, I mean, it's like the busiest place. It's amazing. The number of microbes in that area are just off the charts compared to soil nearby that might not have any roots. If you do that kind of comparison, the rhizosphere is just super rich in terms of the amount and diversity of microbes, bacteria, fungi, viruses, little creepy crawly things, invertebrates, all kinds of organisms like the rhizosphere. It provides a very nice living environment, especially when it comes to nutrient resources, because the roots are leaky. And so those microbes and those invertebrates are like, yeah, this is sweet. I get all this nutrition. And not too long ago, really, we plant biologists thought that plants were just kind of existing their life and they had no say on who's around them in the rhizosphere. Like whoever showed up, they just got to put up with it and deal with it. Now we know that's not the case at all. And it's really fascinating to see that the research coming out where plants can recruit certain microbes over others. They can kill off certain microbes over others. And so they have a way to create their own ecosystem around their roots. And really exciting. So then when you start looking at, okay, who's really there? What kind of microbes are there? You start to get a feel for the microbes that are beneficial to the plant or are pathogenic to the plant. And that's helping growers, especially agricultural growers that have to cut back on pesticides because they're getting outlawed now. Can we use the microbes to help improve the plant's growth and defend them against pathogens and so on and so on. So the rhizosphere area is a very active area. Lots of research going on in this area because this is where you find microbes that tend to hang out with the plant through the plant's lifetime. And so they're there, they're persistent, and we are realizing they're doing a lot of good things for the plant. And yes, pathogens do come along and do their share of harm, but very much like how human researchers are looking at the microbiome in us. That's what they're doing with the rhizosphere. They're looking at the plant microbiome. So very exciting area of research, which I'm a little bit biased toward since I do that, but okay. So roots, what else are they doing? Well, they can essentially do asexual reproduction, vegetative reproduction through the roots, propagating essentially that idea. Storage, of course, we saw those starch grains in the cortex region, so there's storage abilities. I'll show you some pictures of all of this, by the way, but I'm just listing it out right now. They are definitely accessing nutrition in the sense of dissolved minerals, right? So roots are taking up dissolved minerals, but they also have, some plants have what we call parasitic roots, where they aren't really going for what's in the soil. They're diving into another nearby plant and causing problems. So I'll show you and talk to you about that a little bit. Some plants that live along the tidal areas of the ocean, estuaries, they need specialized roots because their roots are submerged for such lengths of time until the tide goes out. And so they've adapted remarkably well after we just got done talking about roots getting asphyxiated because there's no oxygen. They create root tissue that will maximize oxygen flow into their body. So they're often nicknamed snorkel roots, which I think is a great nickname. The fancy term, if you're a botanist, you say it's parenchyma tissue, but I like snorkel roots. So essentially, parenchyma tissue is just tissue where you see lots of air gaps in between the parenchyma cells. So it's very like spongy roots, lots of air pockets in there. And what that does is it allows oxygen to diffuse more rapidly through the tissue to make sure that you don't have asphyxiation going on in the roots. And I'll show you some pictures of that. And then even this idea of movement. So there are some roots that are really nicely specialized. Well, a lot of roots do this actually. They contract and relax, contract and relax, contract and relax. And as they're doing that, it helps them kind of dig deeper into the soil so that they can really get rooted deep. And that, of course, provides more stability to the whole plant. And it's not like something they have to expend a lot of energy on really at all because it's just wet, dry. Once their tissue gets wet and then it dries out, it causes this kind of, that wet, dry fluctuation causes this contractile movement. Some roots will actually have like a corkscrew movement through their roots as they grow and push their way. It's like a corkscrew on a wine bottle opener or whatever, that kind of thing, where you have that corkscrew shape to the roots and it helps them dig deeper into the soil. So let me just, thinking about nutrient storage, of course, you have eaten some of these or hopefully all by now, although I can't do beets. Anyone else have that problem? Do you?
I love these.
I know, so it seems to be kind of a love-hate type thing when I talk to people. I used to spit them at my mom when I was in my high chair and I just never got past it. She never let me forget that. I spit them in her face apparently, and she was not happy with that. So, but anyways, I try to like them. I'm trying, Mom. So, but still haven't succeeded. So nutrient storage. So here, ignore the bananas, but the cassava are these big ones. And taro. So we don't really have that in our diets up here that much, traditionally, but they're very big nutritional crops in the tropical regions, because that's where these plants tend to grow. Very, very big in the diets of people that live in those areas. Cassava, you have to cook it just right, otherwise it poisons you. So don't eat raw cassava. So yeah, one of my grad students went to Brazil with Dr. Leonard's class that she brings down there every once in a while to the Amazon rainforest, and they went to a plantation, cassava plantation, and he ate like the size of a pencil eraser of the cassava tissue, and he knew. It's like, what are you doing, Andrew? I was so mad at him, and they caught him. They saw him do that and they yelled at him. So, but he's like, oh, that hurt me. He wanted to experience what it was like raw, because you can only eat it cooked. But it's like,
How was he doing after that?
huh?
How was he doing after that?
He was fine. He knew the
Oh, that was
limits,
fine.
like, because it's body size too. Like
Yeah.
if you gave a kid that, it might be harmful, but a full-on adult, it wasn't harmful. But don't do that. Please don't do that. So, but some roots can be quite massive. That's a man root, which mainly stores water. And so you can see some roots can get quite large for something like that. And then, pneumatophore is another technical term for the snorkel roots. Again, it's the same idea here, but that's what you're seeing. Whoops, let me go back. So here, this is the tidal flats essentially, and all of these are the snorkel roots for these trees. So low tide, they stick up and they really, take in the oxygen, and they probably have a way of storing it in their air gaps in their roots. And then Sir David Attenborough always says that they hold their breath when the high tide comes back, but they've already stored up enough oxygen that they're good, so you think about these again are snorkel roots. So some can get well above the water table if they're mature enough. So it's really an amazing adaptation for these types of plants along the shoreline. Yeah.
Crap.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. And it's good luck canoeing or kayaking through there.
Box. Those pretty much all saturated.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do the same.
They do have the parenchyma tissue. They do. Yeah. And what's really cool, like corn plants that they don't normally have parenchyma tissue, but if they get flooded enough in a growing season, on that same plant, when it puts out new roots, will switch into parenchyma tissue.
That's good.
Yeah, it's really
That's why they
cool.
have that.
Yeah, it's really cool. So that's what's, they're so amazing, where normally they have just one kind of root tissue, and then on the fly, they can say, oh, I'm switching, and because I'm getting flooded all the time. Aquatic plants, so often what you'll see is root systems that are, if you think about aquatic plants or bog plants, they might not have a great root system. And because roots, one of their main job is to bring up water, but since they're submerged or surrounded by water, they just kind of absorb it through their body. And so Elodea doesn't have a ton of roots. It's an aquatic plant you can find around here in fresh water. And you'll look at it in lab on tomorrow. And when you look at the root system, it's pretty sparse. And again, just not much xylem, actually. They don't really devote a lot of energy and resources to building a massive xylem system, because they just kind of absorb the water. So here's a cross section of Elodea, and there's hardly anything there for xylem. It's very minimal. So you'll look at that in lab. Aerial roots. This is corn. If you've ever wandered a cornfield, they have these roots that are often referred to as prop roots. And then on the right here, you see an orchid. Most orchids are not like the orchids we have here. Most orchids hang out on branches of tropical trees. And so they just dangle their roots. And so you're gonna look at that in lab tomorrow too. They have special velamin, we call it velamin, tissue that makes up their roots. It's green. They actually can do photosynthesis with their roots. And just really, they have multiple layers of an epidermis, just really interesting adaptation because they just dangle their roots in the air off the tree. And then the corn, if you've ever walked through a corn field, you know that they're very, tall. And when the corn on the cob starts to form, it can get kind of heavy, top heavy. So these prop roots are like an architectural design, just trying to stabilize the stem, especially as the plant gets to maturity. And then if you ramp that up quite a bit, you might get something like that. This is a screw pine tree. And those are the very extensive prop roots. So again, if you can imagine a windstorm blowing through here, this plant's pretty well protected against shear winds that are blowing strong. So nice adaptation. And then going back to the orchids idea, because they dangle their roots, they can be green and photosynthetic. This is vanilla. It's a vining orchid that vines around tree trunks in the tropical area. And we get vanilla, lovely vanilla. This is a friend of mine who sent a picture of her blooming orchid, and you can see the specialized aerial roots all thickened up, nice and green. Really quite amazing. So really nice. So I remember, students that have purchased like orchids from the store, they're usually Phalaenopsis genus, and they're worried about those roots that kind of come out on the surface. Like, shouldn't those be buried? And it's like, no, they're adapted to this kind of living. So it's fine to leave the roots dangling. And often if you buy a orchid pot, they have all those holes in the side. That's why. It's for the roots to just come out and dangle. And so, and then look at these banyan tree. Those are roots growing from the branches. So they send the root tissue starts in the branch and starts to grow down. So like adventitious roots. Isn't that cool? When I was visiting, I had a conference to go to. Oh, it was such a hardship. Miami. I had to go to Miami in the middle of winter for a conference. So we went on a bus tour and there was a ton of banyan trees. So I was just like, my sister's like, oh, another plant. And then adventitious roots, poison ivy does this. So be careful. Sometimes they're attached. So these are adventitious roots on a bark of a tree. And then you have the ivy on the bricks where they're nicely attaching. So, and buttress roots. These are like prop roots, but on steroids. So they usually do this in the tropics because the soil is fairly shallow. So they don't go super deep. They stay up toward the surface. Look at that one. All right, we'll stop there.